War conflicts today are being depicted almost instantly. Once something happens on a battlefield, it almost immediately appears in news and is being actively discussed in social networks. There is no scarcity of visual content from battlefields captured both by professional journalists and combatants themselves. However, this has not always been the case. In the early days of photography, the cameras were huge and the process of taking photos rather resembled the process of making paintings. People were depicted in rather static positions, and war photos were dominated by the distanced landscape shots. Everything changed in the 1930s when two photographers essentially invented war photojournalism the way we know it today. They lived amazingly interesting lives, romantic, full of risks, some may even say reckless. At some point, they even shared the same personality and showed the true dedication to their job till their very last moments. A famous English indie rock band, Old J, even dedicated a song to them, Taro. The stories of Robert Capa and Gerda Taro. Initially, I was planning on making this video about Gerda Taro only because of the name of the song. However, the more I was researching her biography, the more I realized how tightly intertwined her story with the Robert Capa. That's why I thought it would be just a crime not to talk about him as well. In 1934, two very different but at the same time very similar people meet in Paris. They are both poor, they are both of the Jewish descent, they are both immigrants, and they both had fled their countries because of the political reasons. Gerda Poharil moved to Paris in 1933 because of Nazi party that came into power the same year. She was detained and got released because of the presence of the Polish passport, and quickly migrated with her entire family. Different parts of her family moved to different countries, but eventually they have never seen each other again. Andrew Friedman shares a somewhat similar story. He left Hungary because of the sympathies to the Communist Party. He lived in Austria, in Czech Republic. He lived in Germany, where he got acquainted with photography and picked up some skills. But eventually he found himself in Paris because Paris at those times was the center of culture. He tries to work as a photographer. He runs with his camera here and there. He tries to take photos and sell them. However, he barely has any success. He's very poor, he wears rugs, he needs to pawn his camera at a pawn store to get the money for a while, and generally not a very rich and a happy life. As well is the case for Gerda. She shares a room with her friend. She's poor, she doesn't have a permanent job, however, she's pretty sociable, a lot of parties, and generally a frivolous life. At some point, Andrew gets an order for shooting from a Swiss company, and for this he needs a blondie model. And no, he does not invite Gerda, he finds and invites a blondie lady. However, this lady is afraid of going alone for a shooting, that's why she invites Gerda. And these two get acquainted pretty quickly, and they develop both romantic and professional relationships. Andrew teaches Gerda to take photos, while Gerda helps him with presenting himself. I think it's obvious for a creative job, it's not only about doing the job, it's also about how to present and promote your work. They start working together, however, they barely have any success. It's important to understand that in Europe of these times, having Jewish surnames was not very commercially beneficial. And although this was France, the anti-Jewish ideas and mood was quite popular in Europe. That's why Gerda comes up with a pretty interesting idea: to invent an American photographer who has come from overseas to Europe to take photos. That's how Robert Capa appears. And this appears to be quite a successful idea because they actually have some success with it. At that point, Gerda had found a permanent job at Allianz Photo, and she helps to promote Robert Capa. And although their plan was quite quickly revealed, they were able to establish this name and they generally have the commercial success. At some point, they get an assignment to cover the Spanish Civil War that was unraveling at those times, and this appears the first major success for them. They provide numerous images both from the battlefields as well as the images of the civilian life of just the usual people going through a war. And they really have the success. Their images are being actively published, and they establish themselves, rather Robert Capa, as name of the industry. That's how an image of a lady practicing shooting with a revolver appeared. This image was taken by Gerda and appeared to be quite popular in news, as well as the picture of a soldier captured in the moment of death when he received a bullet from a sniper. The image was captured by Andrew and also had a tremendous success. In general, there were a lot of images, and again, they appeared to be quite recognized names of photojournalists of that days. Many accused them of being biased as they were covering the war from the Republican side that were fighting the fascist soldiers of Franco. However, the thing that comes to my mind is that when you are speaking about something, and especially when you are covering the war as a journalist, one way or another, you would probably lean towards those people who are next to you. Besides, for them, this particular war was very sensitive because they were the political immigrants and they had fled their countries because they didn't like how authoritarian and totalitarian they were becoming. They saw the ideas of freedom and these were very close to them. That's why they really saw the purpose of promoting and showing as heroes those who fight for liberty, freedom, for human rights. And in a way, they saw their job as fighting fascism. The real value of their images lied within how human-oriented and intimate they were. Besides the fact that they were taken right on the battlefield in trenches, they were so focused on showing the humans' emotions and capturing them in the very moment of the battlefield to show their fear, the anger, the very things that are running through our human brains and capture these emotions. Besides, they were also focusing on civilians, who are one way or another the unwilling participants of every war and how hard it is for them to go through a war. And in a way, this shaped the modern war photojournalism, the way we know it today, with being focused on each person and showing the devastating effects of the war. Also, the advancements of the cameras industry helped them a lot as they were able to use the small and compact cameras right on the battlefield to be right in the middle of the actions and capture the very thin moments. The reports showed that they were using the Rolleiflex and Leicas compact cameras. Obviously, taking photos of war meant a lot of risks for their life, and being in trenches meant that they could instantly get shot or died of explosion, as well as soldiers next to you could. And Gerda was particularly risky in the attempts to take the best shot, and Andrew told her to take less risk, although he's famous for his quote, "If your photos are not good enough, it means you're not close enough." The Spanish Civil War appears to be quite a success for them. They're being actively published, and in 1937, Andrew Friedman is proposed with the position of a head of photography in the newly appeared magazine Si Soir, so he leaves Spain and goes to Paris to work there. It's not like they were living permanently in Spain, they were going back and forth from Spain to Paris, and as well as their relationship worked. They were not a permanent couple, as well as they didn't have the open relationships. This was something in between. They were constantly splitting up and getting back together, and probably they were living the frivolous life the way that many people lived back then. As she finds herself alone in Spain without Andrew, she covers the Battle of Brunei, and this appears quite an unfortunate course of events for her. During the retreat of the Republican forces, she hops on a running board of a truck. However, the uncontrolled tank runs over the truck and inflicts heavy injuries to Gerda. She didn't instantly die, she was delivered to a hospital. However, the next day she died because of the heavy injuries. Obviously, this was just a shocking and devastating news to learn for Andrew, especially considering the fact that he had made a proposal to Gerda not a long time ago. His friends were really worried about him. He thought he would commit a suicide. In Paris, quite a pompous funerals took place, and the headlines were full of the news of the Gerda Taro's death. And unfortunately, despite all of that and all the recognition that she had during her life, her legacy and the knowledge of people of her impact on the photojournalism industry remained almost unnoticed, and there are several reasons for this. The first thing is, despite her having her own pseudonym Gerda Taro, she continued to publish under the Robert Capa pseudonym. She was published both by the Robert Capa and Gerda Taro. The second reason for this was actually the success and popularity of Andrew Friedman, rather, the Robert Capa. He visited multiple wars, he covered multiple wars, and got a lot of success. He became what he really dreamt of. This is almost a quote. He was dreaming of becoming the rich, the famous American. In 1944, he took probably the most famous images of his life, the Magnificent 11, the pictures of the Allied forces landing in Normandy at the Omaha Beach, and the devastating shots of these days. Steven Spielberg, while filming Save the Private Ryan film, got tremendous inspiration from these images. At some point, he obtained the American citizenship and was awarded by the American government for the efforts that he made. He also went to USSR with John Steinbeck that he had met during his life. In 1947, he founded, with other photographers, Magnum Photos Cooperative that was supposed to help photographers to take photos and sell them all around the world. He worked a little bit in the cinematography industry. He was a lover of Ingrid Bergman, and at some point he promised not to cover wars at all. However, he broke his promise. In 1944, he goes to Vietnam to cover the Indochina War. He was passing with the French regiment and decides to get out of the truck to walk on his feet and take photos. Unfortunately, he stepped on a landmine. The landmine exploded. Robert Capa died, almost the way Gerda Taro did, taking photos and covering the war. And that's what the song is all about the death of Robert Capa, although having Taro in the title. I think Old J tried to show the legacy of both these photographers in one song. And I think this is a very dramatic story of showing how Robert Capa finally reunited with Gerda, doing the very same thing and dying in almost the very same circumstances. It's only in 2007 when the suitcase with 4,500 negative images was found in Mexico, which showed that a lot of images that were originally considered to be taken by Robert Capa actually belonged to Gerda Taro and were taken by her. This helped to reinstantiate her reputation in some way and show how impactful her works was for the journalism industry. That's unfortunately how it happens sometimes in life. You make such an impact and influence something a lot. However, your legacy remains almost unnoticed. Stay critical, stay cautious. Goodbye. Нормально, не как уебок выгляжу, да?